He's starting. So, yeah, so this is the first time we've done this in person in almost 2 years.
Yes.
This is the first time we've ever done this on a Wednesday night in a hybrid fashion. We did it yesterday, so we are very well experienced on one day on how to do this. So far, it went really, really well. I just want you to know, everyone that's not here, we can hear you perfectly. If you can't hear us when we're talking, we'll speak up because we do have a mic. This mic, for the people who are here, this and is picking up sound. This mic here is being very soft, but hopefully you'll hear. Hopefully you'll hear. I'll put that mic closer to him. No, and everybody. But hopefully it'll pick it up. We tried it out the other day, and it seems like this mic is good at picking up the sound from in here. We got the screen up, which technically I can show everybody who's there, what you see in the building. What we see right now in this room is up here on this screen. And so we can see the Torah up here, and we can see you in those boxes. So if your computer's live with a camera, we can see you. And so this is all everything that we needed to get in order to be able to do this. This was assembled by our friend Mike Carland. He did an amazing job getting all this stuff in online and having it operational. So I didn't thank him yesterday. I meant to, and I don't know if he's watching it on Facebook. He might be. He's so good and so responsible. Yeah, Mike. Thanks, Joanne. He's been a wonderful guy. He'll be here Friday night when we do services live. We have Wendy doing services this Friday night, and we're gonna have we'll have it streamed at 7:00. So remember, 7:00 we'll be doing the service and have everybody here, hopefully, who feels comfortable coming to services. And no, we will be, by the way, shutting that gate soon. I wanted to give everybody a chance to come in today, but everyone has a code to get into our gate.
Wait a minute, I remember my code, but it didn't work.
It did. I'll do it with you at the end of class. Sometimes it's a little sticky, trust me. He has the real codes. Anyways, it's very easy to remember. It's your street address. It's the 5 digits of your street address.
Mine's not. No, it's mine, but that's besides the point.
Could be. Well, that was the way that we did it for people who didn't ask for a separate code.
No,
So-
mine's a
4-digit code.
For that gate or for the front gate? Okay. Well, normally they're they're 5 digits.
But I don't know what mine is.
Okay. Well, let's see if it's your address.
Because Richard gave me the main.
Okay, let's see if it's that. Well, that one, the front gate for everyone who's watching, because you're all members of the temple, is 5870 is the main code, because it's 5780 or 5870. They both work, but that was the Jewish year when we first coded it.
5780.
Yeah.
That's that one.
Yeah, the 5780 is the 4-digit code. But the other 5-digit code, which is what you get in through the
0150.
through there, it can be should be everybody's street address. But we'll go over it with the people who are here when we leave. And those who are listening, it should work when you come here too. Not Gail, because Gail, we didn't have your street address, but if you do come here in person, we'll let you in. We'll give you a code. Harvey's code still works too, even though he's not here. But so we're gonna get started. We've got now 8 people, 8 computers. I should say people, because some have more than one. We've got 8 computers going. We've got 5 people. We've got 5 people here. We don't have everybody who normally comes, but we did want to recognize the fact that we have the Schulmans from Texas here. We've got Gail out in San Bernardino, Inland Empire area. in Ukaipa. We've got Harvey from Washington. We might get Sarah Renson up later from Oregon when she gets off duty. And yeah, it's quite special that we were able to do that. And we've got people like Francine, who's under quarantine, but she's about, I don't know, 200 yards away. But it's good to have you. We're glad you're here, and she is definitely doing what she needs to do to keep her family healthy, which is why she's not with us live. But anyways, we really do want to make sure everybody who's with us virtually feels like they're a part of this, because in reality, there's more of you there than there are here. That could change week to week, but I think most weeks there'll at least be 50 split. So it's great to have everybody, great to feel that. Hopefully we'll keep this connection that we have going, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with as far as as things grow and as things hopefully continue to move into this new reality of sharing line, that who knows, maybe it'll continue to grow. Right now, we're still small enough that it's a family that everybody kind of knows each other or is getting to know each other. And we hope that it'll keep growing and hopefully not get beyond having that kind of feel and that dynamic where everyone feels they know each other and can jump in. But it is great because in reality, there weren't too many weeks here on a Wednesday night when we would have 15, 16 people. So Mike is shaking his head because Mike and Mary were coming years and years ago where again, sometimes we had 5 or 6. So yeah, this is great. And yeah, but this is great.
Francine's are
Occasionally. It was
Snowman.
occasionally.
Oh, yeah, right.
Joyce
But-
Shulman.
What? Hello? Somebody said something? Oh, okay. Anyways, I do want to tell you that this is it is great, especially having the people who would never be able to come here on a regular basis, but are able to join us from wherever they are. And again, for those that are joining us on Facebook, which I didn't even look, how many people are on Facebook? The only problem with people joining us on Facebook is we don't get the same interaction. We don't get the interactivity of having you be part of the discussion. People oftentimes will type in stuff, which is great. The only problem is we don't see it until or I don't see it until after class. We don't see it live. I guess if I had another computer set up here, I could see it, but we're not that fancy yet. Maybe we will. But we really do want you to. We really do want you to be part of the discussion. We really want people part of the discussion and the back and forth. So that's why Zoom is the preferred method. And don't forget, after they're all done and we lock them away into the vault, they're actually available online because they're all on YouTube. So everything that we've done, occasionally we've had a couple of glitches where things didn't record properly, but for the last 2 years, every one of the classes on Tuesday and Wednesday are on YouTube. So if you have YouTube, you can watch it. I don't know, you could watch it. A lot of TVs have YouTube equipped, so you could actually watch it. I don't know the classes are great on YouTube, but the services are beautiful on YouTube. Some of the videos and some of the music on YouTube sounds phenomenal when it comes through a TV. But that being said, this is the reality that we're now part of so far. Again, I'll say it again for those who came on late. I really do want to thank Michael Carlin for doing a great job of hooking all this up, because there were a lot of moving parts to this. It's not just having a computer. It's not just having even the camera. It's having the computer, the camera, the projector, and then the ability for us to see you and for us to have a fully kind of immersive experience with being able to have you be part of this too, which is why we had to have the projector and the screen up as well. So all of these things had to move together, because otherwise we'd be sitting in a room and it would be kind of weird to not be able to see, and to be able to see you and to be able to see the text. So this is a great thing. And again, wasn't as simple as just plugging in a computer. So, and again, the fact that the sound sounds great too is all thanks to Michael too, because all the speakers that we have, and we can hear you, I promise you, be engaged, talk, we can hear you perfectly. And again, it's phenomenal. And it was a lot of hard work for Michael. So we're going to dive into the Torah portion. And I say the Torah portion because sometimes we finish at the end of a chapter. The Torah portions don't always match with the chapters and verses because, again, the chapters and verses came later. They were put in by Christian scholars. And sometimes they felt to break the chapters and again, to put in what they felt was a good break is not necessarily where we felt it was good to put in a break. So for us, what we finished last week was kind of a narrative unit which talked about Jacob and his brother Esau and his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, and the trick that went on with the trick for getting the blessing from Isaac and then to Jacob. So that was a famous scene in the Bible. The week before, we read the story of how Jacob takes his brother's birthright, takes his inheritance from his brother, which is a separate story. And the fact that they're combined together with the full effect of, and again, not different authors, by the way, same author. For those who question, well, are there two different versions because there's two different stories? No, because actually Esau says last week, he stole my birthright and now he's taken my blessing. And so whoever wrote that definitely knew the other story, and there's no reason to believe the same words, same vocabulary, the same writing styles both stories existed. We have both stories, obviously, but both stories even existed for the writer who wrote it. And the stories combined give us this effect of, again, Esau losing essentially everything. Now, he does get a blessing from his father. He doesn't get the same level of blessing, but he also did something at the end of last week's portion, is it says that Esau realized that the Canaanite women displeased his father Isaac. It doesn't say that it displeased his mother. That doesn't seem to bother him. But it did bother him that his father was not pleased. And it says that Esau went and took a wife from Ishmael's family, which is also his family because Ishmael, remember, is his uncle. So his uncle, Ishmael, Esau's uncle, right? Ishmael is Esau and Jacob's uncle. He had a daughter, and according to this, her name is Mahalat, and Esau marries her, his cousin. And she is very legitimate from the standpoint of her background, her ethnicity, if you will, because she is from Abraham's line. Now, we're going to see today how Jacob gets married. He also, as we heard last week, is being sent to Aram, and he is going to marry a woman from there. So Esau responds to this. Esau responds to his brother kind of doing what his parents wanted. Now, this is where maybe there's a little different authorship, but it really doesn't matter. The story isn't terribly wrong or chronologically wrong, because what we hear is that Isaac sent Jacob off and he went to Padan Aram. That's what it says, right? Went to Padan Aram, to Laban, his uncle. Where we pick up now is actually backwards. Now, again, could be a different author, and that's why it did that. Or you're allowed to tell a story, and then you cut to the next, especially like in a movie, right? You cut to what had happened just before, and you show the other side of it. So it doesn't have to be an issue of chronology. But again, what we have now is Jacob's vantage point as he is taking off. And what's interesting now is that we're really going to see the world from Jacob's eyes. From this point on, from the beginning of Vayetze, which again is the beginning of the Torah portion. When you see the word Vayetze, that is the Torah portion. So we read this back a couple months ago in our yearly cycle. When we see this, now we're going to be following Jacob. The story up until now, even though we were introduced to Jacob over the last couple of weeks, it's really been in relation to his brother, in relation to his mom, in relation to his dad. Now the focus changes to Jacob. The camera, if you will now be following Jacob. And it doesn't mean it's with him all the time for the next 20 some chapters, 22 chapters, but it does for almost all of it. The only time it leaves him is when we go to Egypt and when we follow him, but then we come back to him. And the book of Genesis ends with Jacob and Joseph's death, but really Jacob's death. Joseph's death is the last few verses, but it really ends with Jacob's death. So the next roughly 22 chapters is Jacob and his family. And so, again, we were already introduced to him, but we're introduced to him as a character in his father's story. But now it shifts to him. It is not, as we said, been a long time that we dealt with Isaac as his story. We were introduced to Isaac essentially when he was bound in the Akedah, which was chapter 22. Abraham is still functioning in the next, in Chayei Sarah, buying the grave for his wife. And then really it's not until chapter 25, 26 where we get the story of the birthright. But that means that we're really only reading about Isaac in the book of Genesis by himself, where even then it's not really about him for 3 chapters.
But technically, we don't really know a lot about him.
Technically, we don't know hardly anything, because in those we really read about his father buying the grave. I mean, there is almost nothing about Isaac. And so for us to speculate about what his life was like, it's very hard. He's almost an unknown character. And so, again, it's obvious when we talk about how much text there is. We were introduced to Abraham in chapter 12, and he departs from the scene and he dies roughly around chapter 25, 26. So he's there for 14 chapters. Jacob is there, as I've told you, for 28 chapters. It's just about him. For the previous 3 chapters, it's kind of been about him, 2 or 3 chapters. So there's like 50 of the 50 chapters in Genesis, 30 of them roughly are about Jacob, or 20, 25. It's almost all Genesis. What I'm saying is Genesis is almost all about Jacob and his family, or at least half of it, over half of it. So we really don't know a lot about Isaac. We know a little bit more about Abraham, but we learn a lot about Jacob and his family. And Jacob, ironically, I will say, or coincidentally, is the second most profiled, illustrated, detailed character in the Bible. The most is King David, who ironically we're being introduced to in our Tuesday morning classes. So when we look back at the Bible and we look at who we really know Jacob and we know David. Now, again, you're going to tell me, what about Moses, right? We read about Moses. We read about Moses from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. For 4 books of the Bible, Moses is there talking, he's leading, but what do we really know about him? We have 1 chapter in the Bible in Exodus chapter 2, where we learn about his birth and his fleeing Egypt and his then basically coming to the burning bush in chapter 3. But that's 1 chapter about his life. We know a little bit, we get some other details about a little bit about his wife coming back to him. We learn about his sister and his brother Aaron kind of coming out against him. But we don't know anything about him. And we learn about his death a little bit. We know that Moses buries him in a place where no one can see and no one knows what happens, but we know that happens. But as far as his life, we know almost nothing about Moses' life, about him as a person.
I have a question. I know this is kind of maybe off. I'm just asking about Moses. It seems like Moses, there's a couple of Moseses. Do you know? I mean, the one has anger issues and attacks the seer, and the pours the molten gold down for the. I mean, it just seems like there's sides of Moses.
There Yes, there are definitely different sides of Moses, but again, even then, it's not that we don't really learn that much about him, but we do see different sides to him. Are they different sides to him, or is there an author that's partial to him, and then
That's,
there's an author who's not partial to him?
that's
It's
what I'm
very
wondering. And I'm wondering if it's all written in the same Hebrew, whether, I know like a Song of Songs. is
no,
written
it's
in
not.
Archaic
It's
Hebrew.
not. But the argument would be, and this is the argument that it's not my argument, it's the argument for people who look at the documentary hypothesis. It's actually a big issue because in one author, Moses pretty much does everything right. And then there's another author where he doesn't do everything right. And so there is the theory there that that author is a descendant of Aaron and doesn't really want to make Moses look like the hero. It's more important that Aaron is the hero, right? And so that's a possibility of what the agenda is there. But you are right. There are different sides to Moses, and that might be because the people who wrote those things have an agenda. With Jacob, it's a little bit trickier because
I'm just wondering
Jacob.
if it's written in the same kind of Hebrew. You know, I know there's archaic and there's classical and
No,
there's,
it's all written in biblical Hebrew. The question is it written
so we know it's about the same
there-
time
there-
period.
that's not there. Well, I would say there's not consensus on that, but there is a feeling that yes, it was written all before 500 or 600 BCE. So it's all about 2,500 years old. The text, I shouldn't say all of the text, but most of the text. But it could be 200 or 300 years removed from each other. But in that 200 or 300 years, we don't see necessarily a whole lot of changes. The Hebrew, when we talk about different Hebrews, you know,
Yeah.
especially like the Mishnaic Hebrew, that's 500 or 600 years after that too. So then you're talking almost 1,000 years from when the earliest Hebrew that we have in the Torah and the latest Hebrew, but that we do see it in other books of the Bible. In Genesis itself, we don't, and Genesis through Deuteronomy, we don't see that much change in the Hebrew. There is a change in Hebrew though from Genesis to the book of Daniel. There's a difference between Genesis and Ecclesiastes or the book of Job. So there are differences in those Hebrew,
Esther.
that Hebrew style, or Esther.
Yes, some of the language.
So there are differences when again it's 700-800 years. It's difficult and that's one of the reasons why people can't really date it, because the Hebrew style and the words, the vocabulary between the different authors is not that different. It's more of the words they use, it's their vocabulary, it's some of the phrases that they use, it's some of the places that they talk about, it's some of the people that they talk about or the way they talk. That's a bigger clue, which is actually a better way to probably evaluate it. Well, I don't want to say it's better, but it's a good way to evaluate it.
So in the Jacob story, do we find that is this all written at the same time?
In the what?
In Jacob's story, are we finding that it's connected, that they're all
Pretty
written?
much. You don't have to worry about that. And what I was going to say is that there's less, and this is why I said it's trickier. Jacob is almost always treated as a heroic character, whereas Moses, we sometimes see some problems with him, and David, there's some problems maybe with him. Jacob, for the most part, is going to be depicted as a good guy, because everyone is a descendant of Jacob, and same with Abraham for that matter. Everyone's connected to them, and so you're not going to besmirch him too much. But Jacob does some really weird stuff too. But it's not that he's written off as a problem or doing bad things the way like Reuben or Judah or some of his sons are, because again, if you weren't from that tribe, you have no issue making fun of Reuben or Judah if you're not from that tribe. If you're from that tribe, you're probably not going to make that ancestor look bad. And so everyone's a descendant of Jacob. Jacob usually comes across not as a bad guy. And while there's different kinds of sides to him, almost all the sides are
But as we'll learn
positive.
today, none of gets, yes, marrying Rebecca before he married.
Yeah. So his life is not easy, right? His life is not
Take advantage of it.
it's not easy.
Well, he
But-
just seems shady too, kind of a trickster, you know?
Yes, but that is different from being necessarily somebody who is, got a problem, and therefore everyone who comes after him has a problem. We can't make Jacob too bad, because otherwise then we're all bad. And so Jacob is not going to come across that way. Though some people say, look, the fact that he's a trickster is not a good thing. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I think Jacob comes across as the guy who is trying to get by, and he's trying to get by.
You were saying how they didn't want that Abraham wanted Isaac's son to come from his family, but that they weren't all that great either. So I'm thinking they're kind of shady too. Lebanon.
Well, I will tell you that I think that there's a sense in
Rebecca.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and our ancestors that in some cases they have to do what they have to do to get by. We saw that when Abraham tells Pharaoh that Sarah is his sister, when Isaac does the same thing. I mean, you can argue they're lying, but on the other hand, they say we would have died.
You say all the time is, we're flawed. I mean,
They're flawed, but remember, they're also
we're all flawed.
doing what they have to do to get by.
Right. We all do that.
And so I think at a certain point, and this is why I say the Bible doesn't really have happy endings. It has endings which are much more true to life, which are, we got to where we are. It wasn't easy. We sometimes had to bend it a little bit to get there. We're not happy with it. We didn't want to. We'll admit it. We'll tell people what we did. But in some cases, this is what we had to do to get to where we were. And again, it's not that this is the way we wanted it to be. We're not saying, hey, everybody should do this. This is a happy ending. No, it's saying life sometimes isn't fair, it doesn't work out, and sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands. And just hope and pray that it doesn't work out bad, and that the consequences won't be bad for you or for the people you care about. And again, it's not like they're saying, hey, it's good that Jacob does what he does and it's a good thing. But there's this feeling like, well, what else was he going to do? So I would say that that's oftentimes the way we look at things from the Jewish perspective, which is, most of our ancestors who came to this country with nothing, they didn't want to leave Poland or Ukraine or wherever. They didn't want to leave. They would like to have been left alone, right? They would have liked to have had a normal life where other people could just farm and do their job, but they weren't. And if they hadn't come to this place, we wouldn't be here today. And there's a real feeling like that from the very beginning with Jacob, which is, it was not an easy journey, but I got to this place and I got my family, and there were some scary times, but we got through it. So, and I think a lot of people deal with that, not just 100 years ago for our ancestors, but for us too, So where we're picking up in Vayetze is that now Jacob, and again, we're following Jacob, it says he left Beersheba, which is where he was in the south of Israel, and he goes up Haran. He set out for Haran, which is in modern day Syria. There's a place called Haran, which is this city that has been inhabited for thousands of years. And this is where he sets out to. And he came upon a certain place and stopped there for the night, where the sun had set. Now, at this part, we don't know where the certain place is. It just says he came to a place. Taking one of the stones of that place, he put it under his head and he lay down in that place. And you can hear the word makom, hamakom, 3 times. It uses the word makom for place. So the fact that you heard that word place be repeated 3 times is good, because it's repeated 3 times in the Torah. So clearly that place was an important place. And you're going to see at this time, when he did it, he doesn't know where the place is. But in this place, he had a dream, a stairway, and here it's going to say the note, or ramp, or ladder. We all know it as the stairway to heaven. A sulam is the Hebrew word, sulam. was set on the ground, and its top reached the sky. And angels of God were going up and down it. And the Lord was standing beside him. And he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The ground on which you are lying, I will assign to you and your offspring. By the way, it's interesting that he says, Abraham, your father, and Isaac. Why doesn't it say your grandfather Abraham and your father Isaac, or your father Abraham and your father Isaac? Here it only calls Abraham his father. So it's a little weird. Could be that he's reminding him of his father Abraham, his grandfather Abraham. His grandfather at this point would not be alive. So maybe referring to him as your father in this case is more of your, your grandfather, your father in heaven, your grandfather who passed on. But he does say your father for Abraham. And again, there are different theories about why that is. But he says to him, the ground on which you are lying, I will assign to you and your offspring. Okay. Well, that kind of makes sense because his father blessed him and told him he's going to have the land. But now God's telling him he'll have the land too. But this is reinforcing it at the very least. And he says to him, your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants. Again, similar to what his father had said to him, similar to what God had said to Abraham. And so far, this is a lot of reinforcement. And he says to him, remember, I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now that part seems to be very, very specific to him, to his life, to the moment that he actually cares about right now. Because in all fairness, to a young guy who at that point does not have any children, is not married, who has probably very little, say care, but maybe it's not the highest priority for him at that moment, that he's going to have descendants that will one day be numerous and will have this whole land that he's in, that he's walking through, which is all great news. But God, what about now? And so this is what God says to him now. Now, lest you think I just made that up, or I'm telling you a midrash that somebody wrote hundreds of years later, let us read the next line. Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is present in this place, and I did not know it. And again, the word makom. God was in this makom. God was here in this place, and I did not know it. That is one of the most powerful lines in the book of Genesis, and some people would say in the entire book of the Bible, the whole Bible, the whole book, everything, not one book, the whole book. Because what it really says to us is that God is around us, is here all the time, and it's just we don't recognize it, right? And so when people say, well, where's God?
On your shoulder.
God's with you right now. Now that's a pretty wild idea, and it's one that's really important because again, kind of begs the question of that everybody has, where's God? And this guy just realized that God was with him. Now the question of course is, did he ever before that time ever talk to God? Did he ever feel God? Did he ever believe in God? Which of course then gets to the bigger question, which is, at least for Jacob, was he able to behave the way he did? Now, assuming that, again, we're saying he was somewhat tricking his father, because we saw in the last chapter that we read that he tricks his father. He never says to his mother, hey, maybe that's not a nice idea to trick our father. His response was, right, what if we get caught? He doesn't say, I don't think it's a good idea to trick him, right? It's It's not respectful. He never says that. He says, what if we get caught? Again, we normally say that Jacob was kind of born perfect. He was a good kid from the beginning. But we know he likes his mom. We know he's good to his mom. We know he's not maybe the kind of guy that his brother is, which is kind of a ruffian and a guy who doesn't really care about the family and those kind of things, whatever. I mean, he's not like Esau. Are we really sure he's a good guy yet? Is he really a good guy yet? And does he have any sense that he's in the divine presence? We don't know until this moment. And this is the moment that we could say that maybe the lights went on for Jacob, where now his actions are informed by the feeling that he now knows he's in the presence of God and that God is with him. So this is a really special line that he says. God is in this place. God's here. That's the words he said. God is here. Yesh Adonai. Know there's a God. And I didn't, he says, and I didn't know it. So keep that in mind. But then again, as I told you, shaken, he said, how awesome is this place? There is none other than the abode. This is none other than the abode of God. And this is the gateway to heaven, the Shara Hashemayim. This is the gate to heaven, Shara Hashemayim, the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he named that site Bethel. But previously, the name of the city had been Luz. So the Bible just told us that he made a site. He called it right here, as you see the note, the house of God, Beit El, Bethel. That's what the word Bethel means. So he names the site, and then the city that ends up growing up there around that site, Bethel, was a holy city. It's a city where there was eventually going to be a temple to God. A temple to God. That's right. Seems to be a temple of God going all the way back to Jacob, by the way, which is, by the way, maybe a key to who wrote that. Somebody who lives in the north and thinks that Bethel is a holy place that Jacob dedicated, and it's a house of God, and it's a gateway to heaven. I mean, that's a pretty special place. And so it had a name before. It was called Luz. But now, or in our days, and they don't say it here now, we all know it as Bethel, but he says that's what it's called. So there is a place called Bethel. There was a place after the Jews returned during the time of Moses and they established these cities. There was definitely a feeling like when they reestablished that city, maybe it was always there and never stopped, that Jacob had dedicated that place and that was a holy place where you could pray to God. When the northern kingdom split off from from David, from Judah, tribe of Judah, during the time of King David, right after he died and King Solomon was king, the northern tribes split off and created the kingdom of Israel. That city of Bethel was their religious holy city.
Not that far back then.
Yes. So roughly 3,000 years ago, there was a Jewish temple there. According to this, what we just read, it goes back all the way to Jacob. It wasn't like they decided Bethel is going to be our holy city. No, they said all we did was make the site that Jacob had dedicated a holy city again. And so Bethel on one end of the kingdom and Dan on the other. And so the northern kingdom had two holy cities, Dan in the north and Bethel in the south, where they offered up sacrifices, they had altars, and they prayed to God. And they did that for 300 years, 250 years, during which time there were some Jews, we actually would call them not Israelites, but the tribe of Judah, Judeans, who would go to Jerusalem to worship. But for 250 years, there were Jews that were worshiping in Jerusalem, and they were also worshiping at Dan and Bethel. In 250 years, they were rival temples, rival places where Jews prayed. Once the Assyrians destroyed Bethel and Dan, those temples ceased to exist as temples. They weren't existing as temples anymore. They weren't used. What?
Were they just let go or?
Yeah, they were destroyed. And then when the Jews returned after the Babylonians had exiled them 100 years later, they rebuilt Jerusalem as a holy city. But nobody ever rebuilt Dan and Bethel. Now we've gone back and excavated at least Dan. We haven't really excavated much about Bethel. We did. We went through the beautiful forests up in that area. We've done it on some trips, not all the trips. We've gone to Dan and we can actually see where that altar was for that 250 years or so. The question was it a holy site before that? Probably. It wasn't just that the northern kingdom decided to make those places holy. According to this, it went back to Jacob. Did it go back to Jacob? It's hard to know, but it definitely went back before the kingdom there. There were Jewish sites around Israel where people offered up sacrifices. Bible tells us, as we're reading the book of Samuel, as we're reading on Tuesdays, that for a while the people offered up sacrifices at Shiloh during King Saul's time, and when Samuel was there, they were offering sacrifices at Shiloh. So we know there were other places where Jews were offering sacrifices. The Bible tells us in the book of Judges that there were these Levites that were offering sacrifices in lots of places. But at a certain point, everybody in Judah said, you have to go to Jerusalem. And then they made sure everybody would do that. And then when the kingdom split, one of the first things they did was say, you know what? We're going to pray in our areas. We're not going to Jerusalem anymore. So it's only confusing from this point. Once the Babylonians destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, the Assyrians had 150 years before destroyed these other two temples and all the other temples that were in the north. When the Jews came back 75 years later from Babylonia, from Persia, the only temple that was rebuilt in Israel was Jerusalem. And for the next 450 years, the only place that people went to offer sacrifices was Jerusalem. And that was the time when the priests, the Kohanim, were clearly in charge, because they did not allow anyone to offer up sacrifices anywhere else. And they had that much power, and they had no rival. There was no rival place, with one exception, and that was the Samaritans. The people who lived in the north continued to offer up sacrifices where they wanted to. And they didn't do it in Bethel, and they didn't do it in Dan because they didn't live there. They didn't live in that area. But they didn't seem to have an issue making their own place of sacrifice, which was Mount Gerizim, which is not far from Jerusalem, but it's in the north, about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. They offered up sacrifices there. For the whole time that the Jews were going to Jerusalem, during that time, they were going to Mount Gerizim. They did it after the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. They were going to Mount Gerizim. And on this very moment, in 2 months, 2.5 months, when it's Passover time, the Samaritans will gather on Mount Gerizim to offer up the Passover sacrifice on the same place that they've been going to offer sacrifices for over 2,000 years. So, the Jews only offer up sacrifices in Jerusalem? No. Did the Kohanim only want them to offer up sacrifices in Jerusalem? Absolutely.
It's also a matter of money as well, right?
Well, it was a big matter of money.
Which is what Jesus became against.
What a lot of Jews had a problem with was the amount of
Also,
money.
Jesus didn't-
But
I mean, it's wild, but he throws over the tables.
yes, and he's upset the fact that this was a big part of the worship was commerce. But it was upsetting to lots of other people. Now, I will tell you that there was another temple that was established in Egypt. For a brief period of time, Jews in Egypt decided that they were going to worship in Egypt, that God was in Egypt too. And they looked at probably places in the Bible like this and said, well, isn't God in our place too? And so they had a temple in a place called Leontopolis. And we know about it because Josephus wrote about it, and other writers in the Roman era wrote about it. But there was a temple in Egypt, which was built along the lines of the temple in Jerusalem for Jews there to offer sacrifices. There were some people who thought it was garbage, even in Egypt. There were people who said, yeah, why not? We'll offer sacrifices here. They've been not really excavated very well, but there's no reason to believe that it didn't happen. So this issue of where to worship and how to worship has been an issue for thousands of years. There was very rarely a time when Jerusalem was the only place to offer sacrifices, but there was a good period of time for about, I would say for about 400 years. We don't know so much about what the Samaritans did at Gerizim at that point. We have a little bit of information, but there was a period of time during the return, the Persian period, we call it, when the temple in Jerusalem was pretty much it. Pretty much it. Yeah. So Bethel gets its holy designation as a place where Jacob was. But let's go back to Jacob for a second, because Jacob, who woke up feeling all spiritual, now does this. Jacob made a vow saying, if God remains with me, if he protects me on this journey that I am making and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return safe to my father's house, the Lord shall be my God. So God had just told him he was going to do all that. And he recognized that there was a God. But it says that Jacob actually has to say it out loud. And actually, the way he says it seems to be somewhat, I'll accept God as long as the conditions are met. So my belief in God is conditional. I've always had a problem with that because it doesn't seem like Jacob's holy experience, his spiritual awakening, has really turned him into somebody who is living in the all the time. Because what he really does, at least what the Bible just said, is he woke up from his spiritual experience and says, okay, but what does it mean on a day-to-day basis? And so when I pointed out to you the fact that God tells him, I'm going to take care of you with this, I'm going to make your descendants great, don't worry about the future will be great for you. You'll have this whole land, you'll have a lot of descendants. God actually told him, but I'll take care of you. I'll take care of you. Why? Because Jacob seems 100% to care about it. Makes sense. He's a human being. He doesn't wake up and say, hey, if God gives me lots of descendants, if God gives me this land like he promised me, then God will be my God. He actually says, if God takes care of my immediate physical needs, that's all he says. God protects me on my journey. If God gives me food, if God gives me clothes, if I can come back, then he'll be my God. Because that's all he really cares about. He doesn't care about the promise of the future. First of all, there's no way he's going to know that. He can't say if my descendant, because how will that ever be shown? So Jacob, like all of us, when it really comes down to it, says, God, what can you do for me? And it's a transactional relationship with God. It's literally, what will I get in return? If God does this stuff, then that's my God. But he actually expects to have this stuff, and then the Lord will be my God. That's what he said. So I think there's something really important to point out here, which is that Jacob, like all of us, at the end of the day, is concerned about here and now. He's concerned about what's going to happen in his lifetime, and not even like at the end of his lifetime. What's going to happen tomorrow when I wake up? And as much as he has this great recognition of God, and maybe even now prays, we never heard Jacob pray before. Maybe this is the first time that Jacob, it's not really a prayer, but Jacob's recognition of God, if you will. Is this the first time that Jacob ever really talked to God or made a vow to God? I don't know if it's really a prayer. He says, Torah uses the word vow, vayidar, the same word we use for, and it says, vayidar neder, he made a vow, like kol nidre. but anyways, he's in a transactional relationship with God.
It
So-
doesn't seem to show a lot of faith.
No, and he actually wants to see return
Yeah.
before he,
I'll believe in you if you do all this for me.
yeah, which is interesting because that essentially means, and I'm not going to ruin the story for you to tell you he comes back to the land. He makes it back, right? It's going to take a few chapters, but he does come back. Does that mean the whole time he's up north with his father-in-law, getting married, having kids, that whole time? Is he still waiting to come back to the land before he says, yeah, God, you did everything you promised. Now I'm going to be a good person. Now I'm going to recognize you. Now I'm going to say that you're my God. That's what he says. Then the Lord will be my God.
So he does not have blind faith.
Doesn't seem to. Even after he had this experience. I mean, he has a spiritual epiphany, as we call it, right? He has a moment where he understands that God is in that place. And it's really interesting because it doesn't make him have what you'd expect maybe, right? To have blind faith. I mean, he just had God speak to him. And so I think it's an interesting lesson for all of us too, which is if we had an epiphany, if we had a moment where we were 100% sure that there's a God and we're part of something bigger and everything else, at the end of the day, would we wake up the next day saying, but God, what about, giving me the things I want? So at least according to this, that's what Jacob does. Which, again, I'm not saying it excuses us to do the same thing, but it definitely would say Jacob doesn't seem to be beyond that. And I wonder if we are. I wonder if we're any different. I wonder if it came down to it, even if we had a vision of God, even if we were 100% sure that God existed, at the end of the day, we'd ask the same question. So what? What does it mean to me? Would it change our behavior? Would it change the things that we say? Would it change our prayers? I mean, if we had blind faith, use that word. If we had blind faith, would it change our prayers? I don't know.
The way we do have blind faith, we have to come into it at some point in our lives and say, we believe in God. There's no truth other than what other people have meant in our Torah and stuff like that. But, it is in a way, blind faith.
Well, again, keep it in mind. I mean, I don't know that Jacob isn't changed by the experience, right? Maybe it does make Jacob be a better person. I don't know. But at least if his acceptance of God is still conditional on him returning back home, that means it's going to take for the next 20 years. And that's how long it is. He's going to be gone for 20 years. And it's arguably the most important part of his life. It's when he's going to have kids. It's when he's going to start his business, when he's, it's this 20-year period of his life. I mean, just so you know, he's 40 years old right now. So it's the time he's 40 to 60. But even if we say, well, he's a little bit behind, he's 10, 15, 20 years behind his peers, it's still the time that he's going to do all the important things in his life. And yet is in the back of his mind still saying, well, this is still conditional. We're going to still see how God does. Because he doesn't say, if God protects me on this journey I'm making, but he actually says he has to return to his father's house. Now, again, you can make the argument that's all he cares about is being able to come back home, which is a great thing. It means that he really does want to come back home. But what does it mean for the next 20 years of his life? Is he still saying, well, we'll see, God, I don't know. I'm not home yet. I don't know. I mean, that's at least a possibility based on what the text says. So, this stone, which I have set up as a pillar, shall be God's abode. Of all that you give me, I will set aside a tithe for you. I will give you 10% of everything that I have. Now, this is where the chapter and verse breaks, because it then says Jacob resumed his journey. Now, you could make the argument, well, But is that really a place to break it? Because it seems like everything that came before, which should still be part of this narrative. So again, it's the night. That's a little story. It's a story of how Bethel becomes a holy place. You could also make the argument it's how Jacob realizes that there's a God. If it's the origin of Bethel, it's super important. It's super important from that standpoint. Today, we probably focus on because a holy temple anymore, it's not a holy site that we go to. We probably focus more on the Jacob. What does it mean for Jacob? But the reality is, the reason that this story was so important, the reason why it was so critical, is because it explained to the people of Israel why Bethel is so important. This is God's abode. This is Beit Elohim. It also, of course, says that Jacob's going to give 10%. So believing in God is not all he says he's going to do. He's going to set aside 10%. Now, one can make the argument, this is, again, the origin of a tithe. This is the first time we've heard about it. And that, again,
But isn't when the Kohanim in Jerusalem, that's what they want, isn't it the same thing, a tithe? It's supposed to be a certain percentage of what they own, right? Because if they don't give a certain amount, they can be in trouble with the Kohanim. I thought that was the whole, when they collected money that time of year.
yeah, well, that means that it's not about just the priest, right? This is about setting aside something for God that you do, whether you give it to the priest, whether you give it to the temple. At least this says that there's a tithe that is to God, however you understand it, something's being set aside. Now, he wasn't going to sacrifice a tenth of everything, but he's basically saying it's not mine. 10% of everything that I have is going to God, is not mine. Which again could mean that he's going to give it to the poor, that he's going to give it to, people who are, people who need to have food that are not his family. I mean, it doesn't have to be just, being sacrificed. But there is this sense that a tenth of everything I have is not going to be for me, it's going to be for God. Now, a lot of people say, well, Jews don't tithe anymore. And the Bible says we're supposed to tithe. Jacob tithes. And then, as Doreen says, we have tithes in the book of Leviticus, in the book of Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Throughout the last 3 books of the Torah, we have tithing over and over again. So at a certain point, it definitely gets connected to the worship in the temple, but it predates the temple, which means that Jacob, by saying he's going to give a tenth, sets the standard for everybody who comes after him, whether there's a temple or there's not a temple. So, this is Jacob saying, I'm going to give 10%. As I point out to people today, look, and people say this jokingly, they said, well, if every Jew gave 10% of their money to the temple, then the Jewish community would have beautiful sanctuaries and there'd be beautiful synagogues everywhere. And everything. Like, if they tithe. And again, there are churches that encourage people to literally and give 10% of their income to the church. And there are people who do it. I will tell you that most people in the Jewish community do not give 10% of their wealth to charity, whether it's the synagogue or all of their charities.
Maybe if the government didn't take more than 10%.
Yes, and that's what I was going to say, Joyce. But I'll let you say it because you've been paying taxes a lot longer than I have, and it has been proven that again, as tax rates go up, then charity tends to go down because people feel like they've already given. I will tell you that that's one of the incentives for some of the tax, some of the tax laws favoring, nonprofits to encourage people to give to them so that they can at least take a tax write-off for that. Well, thankfully we have those in this country, but it is it is a difficult proposition to ask people who are being taxed so heavily to also remember to give charity, because they already feel like they've given a lot already. And if it's 30% or 40%, it's a lot of money. Even if it's 25%. I mean, remember, if you're giving a tithe, you're giving 10%. If you're giving what the nominal tax rate is, you're giving a lot more. 20, 25, 35% is a lot more than 10. So it's hard. I mean, it's a hard argument to make for people who are already giving so much money. Back in the day when we're talking about this, you're going to say, well, people had taxes back then, right? They had to support the government. The Romans took a tax. They absolutely did. But in most cases, if governments taxed people at 30, 35%, there were revolutions and people would get killed. Most people did not want to give up a third of their stuff. So it's tough. It's a tough argument to make in today's world. And we kind of take it for granted, but it was not taken for granted. And if you gave 10% to the temple or to the priests, and you gave 10% to the government, so then maybe you're given 20%. You weren't given 30%, you weren't given 40%. So that is something to think about, at least when we read about the first tithing, which is not in the book of, not after the Torah is given. To some extent, it's given to Jacob, to our ancestor. So back to the journey. It says, Jacob resumed his journey and came to the land of the Easterners. By the way, somebody's going to say that I encourage people not to pay taxes today. I know someone's going to say that the rabbi gave a message about not paying taxes. I never said it. I never said that. I don't want to have our tax status taken away. No, I will tell you that that's not what I said at all. I assume that everyone here is paying taxes. As a matter of fact, that whole little rant there was predicated on the fact that we are paying taxes. So it says, though, that Jacob resumed his journey and came to the land of the Easterners, which is, again, B'nai Kedem, the way it's translated there, is the people who live in the East, which is his family. Now, technically, it is East. The words Kedem also imply the place where we came from, which, interestingly, for most of us in America who are American Jews, most of us, when we talk about going back to the homeland, we're talking about going back east. So for most of us, some of us, that might be Brooklyn or well, it's usually Brooklyn or the Lower East Side, because that's where so many of us came out of. But it is interesting that the land of the East is also implied the land where we came from. And the word Kedem in Hebrew also is synonymous with the words tradition and looking back in a nostalgic way, in a positive way, which is why there's a food company that some of you buy from. If you even go to Ralph's or Vaughn's and find Kedem, grape juice or matzah or whatever other Jewish products, Kedem is a pretty large company. That's what it means. It means the East, but it also means tradition. And so Kedem is here, the land of our ancestors, the land of where we came from. So I don't know if that'll always be the case, but it's interesting that it's oftentimes to the East. We look to the East, back to where we came from. So there before his eyes, when he got to this place, was a well in the open. 3 flocks of sheep were lying beside it. For the flocks were watered from that well. The stone on the mouth of the well was large. So again, to kind of put this into something you can see and imagine, they're at a well, or Jacob's at a well, where the flocks come, where the sheep are. And they're watered from this well, and assumedly there was a well, a hole in the ground, but around the well, there is a trough that goes around the well. and they would pull out the water and fill up the trough, and that would be where the animals would drink from. And that's the way the wells were usually done in the ancient world. And sometimes there are wells, which imply that they are filled with water, especially rainwater. Usually only rainwater. And that is the word for well that we have is a bear, like Beersheba, bear. But there's also a word that we have in Hebrew, which is an ain or ain, which is a spring. Now a spring is really cool because that's always got water, because it's an aquifer. There's a water that comes underneath it, and it doesn't need you to put water in it. It's going to give you out water. So an ain, a spring, is really good. But the well oftentimes needed to be filled up, or it would get filled up as an aquifer also under the ground, but didn't seem to always necessarily have water. Sometimes the bear can be empty. And that's important, because we're going to read about Jacob's son Joseph being thrown into a well that didn't have water. So sometimes they have water, and it's also interesting to think about what happens at the well, because we met Rebecca at a well a couple chapters ago, and we read about wells even in Abraham's time, how important they were. And so a well is very important. And again, it's where people met. It's where people would congregate. It's where people would always have to go to the well. It was one of the things that you had to do. Going to the cooler, right? The water cooler. But in this case, it's also the internet, because it's where it's much more of people coming together from all of their different places of work. And in those days, it was the well for shepherds. And the other place that we see when people are a little bit more cosmopolitan is the gate of the city. You could almost see the transition time from when people had wells to when they have gates. Now, the cities would have wells too, but there'd usually be more than one well. It wasn't necessarily one well, but the gate of the city was a central place where people would congregate and they would meet there. So we see that when they become less shepherd, more city dwellers. But now they're still Jacob and his family and everybody. They're all shepherds. So they're nomads. And so the wells were very important, and where people would water their flocks was very important. And we know about this place that the stone on the mouth of the well was very large. And what does it tell us? When all the flocks were gathered there, the stone would be rolled to the well and the sheep watered. And then the stone would be put back in its place on the mouth of the well. So essentially the well would be open for business. When everyone got there, then they would roll the stone away, and then everyone could have their water. And then it got put back. And assumedly, a normal person could not roll this stone away. It was too heavy. So it needed more than one person. It needed, a few guys to get it together so that they could open it up. Now, Jacob said to them, by the way, it doesn't really say who he's talking to, but assuming it's more than one person because it's a plural. My friends, my brothers, actually is the word he says. Achai, where are you from? And they said, we're from Haran. He said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, yes, we do. So now he knows he's in the right area, and he also knows that these people know his family. And he continued, is he well? And they answered, yes, he is. And there is his daughter Rachel coming with the flock. Vehine Rachel. Here is Rachel. And this is how we see Rachel for the first time at the well too. And he said, it is still broad daylight, too early to round up the animals, water the flock, and take them to pasture. But they said, we cannot until all the flocks are rounded up. Then the stone is rolled off the mouth of the well and we water the sheep. So what's going on here in this weird conversation that he has with the shepherds? While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with his father's flock, for she was a shepherdess. Okay, kind of makes sense. Again, Rachel's coming up now with the flocks. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his uncle Laban, in the flock of his father Laban, Jacob went up and rolled the stone off the mouth of the well, and he watered the flock of his uncle Laban. So, what seems to have happened is that when Jacob sees his cousin there, he gets so excited that he decides that he's going to roll off the stone and he's going to help her water her sheep by himself. Now, remember, this is a guy who's come from out of town. They've told him what the rules are. They tell him we wait until everybody's here before we roll it away. And he doesn't care. He sees her. And again, as the rabbis point out, he's so overcome with excitement, adrenaline, that he moves the stone away by himself. That's how excited he is to have Rachel there. Now, again, you could say, well, why didn't you just go up and talk to her? Well, he doesn't. He kind of shows off. He kind of proves himself, if you will, to her right away. And that's what it says he does. Because the next line says, he kissed Rachel. Jacob kissed Rachel and broke into tears.
I don't believe that.
Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. Now that's a crazy scene. Kissing Rachel before he even tells her who he is. Now he tells her right away. It's not like it says, he waited to tell her. He tells her. But he didn't tell her before he kissed her. He kissed her and started crying. Now, he seems very emotional, very emotional. But you can understand maybe why, from the standpoint of he ran away from, he had to run away from home. He didn't run away from home. He had to run away from home. And he's never been here before. He's never been to this place. He's never met his cousin before. He doesn't know what she looks like. And what's going to happen to him when he comes to this place? And the whole incident is very strange. And the Bible points out how strange it is, including the strange part that he kissed her without even telling her who he was. So he seems to be very emotional. He seems to be very, very overcome with his feelings, that he doesn't seem to play by the rules, if you will. Now, was this a horrible thing he did by kissing her without telling her who he was? Was this a horrible thing he did by moving the stone away without waiting for everybody to come? Maybe not.
Kissing her was a little brazen.
So maybe kissing her, because he knows who she is. She doesn't know. But it does tell you right off the bat that he loves her and that he is very excited to see her. There's no intimidation. There's no trepidation. There's nothing holding him back at all. And again, you could say maybe he's brazen. Maybe it's too bold. Maybe it's not what a guy is supposed to do. But her response when he tells her, she doesn't hit him. She doesn't say, who are you? What are you doing that? What are you getting out? He tells her, and then she runs home and tells her father. So that's what she does. Does not say that she was upset about it. Does not say that she thought he was too bold, is too forward. But the whole scene of him doing this, and again, we're going to read later on that Moses meets Zipporah at the well. These meetups at the well are very important. Very important. I always like to, when I tell people when they get married, they meet on the internet, I tell them, well, that's what the well was like in the biblical period. That was where people met. And in this case, again, the meeting is very dramatic because he kisses her, but it also says he cried. It's very emotional. He's very emotional that he sees her. Now look, we actually read the Midrash on this about a year ago, so I don't expect people to remember this necessarily. There's an interesting Midrash here. When he gets there, he doesn't have anything. Well, we're going to know this from what we're going to read in a second. He doesn't have any money. Doesn't have any, he doesn't have anything. And he seems very emotional. So there's a midrash that there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
And the midrash on this is interesting because it implies that the reason that he doesn't have anything and the reason why he gets there, he's all emotional and crying and like, this doesn't seem to be like a normal journey. The only thing we read about is that he had a vision of God. But the midrash posits that there actually was something that we didn't see in the Torah, which is that on the way, he gets chased and almost killed, which is a much better story than the one we have here. Much more dramatic. Who's chasing him? Who's going to kill him? Esau. So the midrash is that Esau wants to get him, and that Esau didn't wait until his father was dead to try to kill him. Because we just read that Esau says, I'm going to kill him when my father is dead. Well, his father doesn't die. And maybe he decides, I'm not going to wait for my father to die. I'm going to kill him now. So the midrash actually is that Esau, or one of Esau's kids, because remember, Esau already has kids by this point, that he sends one of his kids off to kill Jacob. And Jacob doesn't die, but he loses everything. He gets thrown into the water. He loses everything. By the time he gets to Haran, he doesn't have anything left. There's nothing. Everything's gone. He shows up with nothing. And he's had a near-death experience, which makes it seem like the fact that he's now reached these people and that he's now kind of part of the way home. Still got to marry her, but he's part of the way. So maybe again, his feeling like God is giving him what he wanted to have happen, which is, make my mission be successful. So if I got here, I'm halfway home to some extent, because all I have to do is get home now with my wife. Now, as I told you already, it's a 20-year get home period. But of course, he didn't think it was going to be 20. He didn't expect it to be 20 years. But anyways, at this point, again, he feels like he's halfway home, maybe. What happens when she tells her father? On hearing the news of his sister's son, Jacob, which is a fancy way of saying nephew, but they don't have a Hebrew word for that, by the way. Laban, they do now, which is essentially Ben Dod, which just means the son of my uncle. It's not a good word either. It's like they don't have a good word for cousin in Hebrew. They didn't have one. There's not a biblical word for it. So Ben Dod is my uncle's son is, yeah, it's technically correct, but should be a better word for cousin. There should just be a word cousin, but now. So Jacob, his nephew, right? Laban ran to greet him, and he embraced him and he kissed him. So he doesn't seem to be upset with him, kissed him and took him into his house. He told Laban all that had happened. So Laban seems pretty good so far. Looks like a good guy. There are no warning flags yet. Say yet. Kind of gives away. And Laban said to him, you are truly my bone and flesh. And when he stayed with him a month's time, Laban said to Jacob, just because you're a kinsman, should you serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? So according to this, he's living there for a month. It doesn't say he's been working for him, but he must have, because he says to him, you've been working for me for a month. I haven't paid you anything. Don't you think you should get paid? So he's there with him a month before they actually sit down and talk about, well, what's the future? What's in your future? So far, it's all good. So far, Laban has said nothing but nice things to him. So far, Laban has said nothing but protective things to him. I mean, it seems to be looking out for him. Laban seems to be looking after him, because he says, what will your wages be? Tell me how much you want to make. Which, by the way, is an interesting way to negotiate with your worker, but it's what he says. But Laban had two daughters. He had two daughters. The of the older one was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, and Rachel was shapely and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel, so he answered, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. So we know the story pretty well, but I want you to pay attention to the story because you can see what happens here, maybe in a new and different way. So bottom line, the question was asked, what were going to be your wages? And here we get to the answer. What's the answer at the end? I will serve you for 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. That is the wage. The wage is your daughter, Rachel. Now, we know that Rachel was the younger one. There's a midrash that they're twins too. Just so happens that Rachel was born after her sister. Doesn't say that in the Torah. Doesn't say they're twins. I think the midrash liked it because it's good. It's a nice balance to the story. Of course, that implies that Leah was supposed to be married to somebody besides Jacob. Who was she supposed to be married to? Esau. Right? If they were twins, and even if they weren't twins, if Esau is the older brother, shouldn't Esau have been married to Leah? The older brother with the older sister, the younger brother with the younger sister. So there seems to be an implication here, to some extent, that that's not the way it happened. Was that Isaac and Rebekah's doing? Now again, we don't know that they're twins, but even it doesn't really matter. If there are two daughters that Laban has, again, Rebekah's brother, Laban, has two daughters, and Rebekah has two sons. It seems to be it's not 7 brides, it's 2. It's not that hard. It seems like it makes sense that the cousins get married off to each other, which happened all the time. It was not uncommon, that was normal. But it didn't happen. And so there's almost an understanding here that something goes off the rail right from the beginning with Esau not being a part of this plan. Whose doing was that? Was that Rebekah's doing? Was that Isaac's doing? We don't know. But Esau married other women.
Rabbi,
3 others. Yeah.
if that's the case, that Esau was supposed to marry Leah, then that is yet another thing that Jacob took from Esau.
Correct. And so there's a real question here. Did he take it from her, or was it taken from him by somebody else, including maybe his parents? Or did Esau have an opportunity to marry her and to go up there himself, and for whatever reason not go up there? Was Esau's decision to marry the local women a reflection of his desires, his parents' neglect? But something happens here with this matchup, which doesn't seem to follow the way it should follow. And we know that because we know a little bit of the story. But just keep in mind the fact that there were 2 brothers that could have matched up perfectly with these 2 sisters, which again, it doesn't say they're twins. I doesn't say that. The Midrash says it because they like the balance to that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Isn't it so that the oldest daughter is supposed to, or child is supposed to be married before?
Correct. Well, you're jumping the gun there, twin. We're actually read it. The Bible actually says it. You're 100% right. The Torah actually says that. Now, we have an issue here too, which of course we always have to talk about because we don't really, there's really no way to read this without talking about it, which is, what is this business that Leah had weak eyes and Rachel was shapely and beautiful? What does that even mean? What do weak eyes even mean? Now, Rachel being beautiful and have a good shape. What? We don't know. But why is that balanced off with Rachel was shapely and beautiful? Because it doesn't seem like weak eyes, so she didn't see well. So she had cataract, whatever. So it doesn't seem like that's really, maybe there's something here which we don't understand, which again, maybe the phrase weak eyes, and it's not weak, ve'ene lea rakot, that again, the word rakot and ene seems to imply weak eyes, but it could be that phrase was that she was not as attractive or not pretty, that weak eyes aren't the fact that her eyes were weak, but that she was not easy on the eyes, to put it mildly. It's possible. That's an interesting one, which seems to imply more that she is nice with the tender eyes, right? It implies that there's something special about her eyes that is a good way. And that seems to be almost like making it, she's got something good and she's got something good. Now, in all fairness, most people would want to have what Rachel has. Now, the words shapely and beautiful, how do they translate it there?
Beautiful and well favored.
Yeah, translation. Because the words yafat toar, and then the yafat mar'eh, yafat ta'or means she was beautiful to look, she looked beautiful, and she was beautiful to look at, and she looked beautiful. I mean, it doesn't really translate well, which is translated as shapely and beautiful, because they think that that's probably kind of what it meant. But it really means that she was beautiful, or she looked beautiful, which kind of implies that she didn't look at things like in a beautiful way, right? It's that when you looked at her, she looked beautiful. But it's interesting that both of the phrases have built into them something with the way you see it, right? Ene, with your eyes, literally means with your eyes. The words ta'or and mar'eh both have as their root the word ra'ah, to see. But all of it seems to be about perception. All of it seems to be about what you see or what you saw in her or in each one of them. So it's really interesting that there's almost a recognition here that it's all about perception, that beauty to some extent is all about perception. Shapely and beautiful is a connotation that, well, she had a good shape and that her face was beautiful. Could be that's what it means. That could 100%. I'm not saying that's not what it means, but it's interesting that both words have at its root ra'ah, to see, and ene also has at its root eyes. So all of this is about the way we see things. There's a recognition that all beauty is not just skin deep, but all beauty essentially is in the eye of the beholder. It's all in what you see. It's all in what you think is beautiful. So there seems to be an understanding that these were known things about these women. It's very interesting, again, that whatever we take away from this, and again, Mary's translation, which is, a translation that people have been reading for a long time, the idea of her eyes being tender really has a connotation more of, again, not that she looked anything but beautiful, but that she had tender eyes, meaning that she was tender, that she was nice, that she was kind, that her eyes were kind eyes. But it doesn't really matter at this point. It doesn't matter because we know that Jacob loved Rachel. So even if he kissed her and fell in love with her, love at first sight, his love hasn't changed after he met Leah. So Leah's in the picture, but he still loves Rachel. He says, I will serve you for Rachel. He doesn't say, I'll serve you for one of your daughters. He says, I want Rachel. So it's very clear what he wants. And it's very clear from the beginning, as readers, that we know that she's the younger daughter. And as Joanne said, we'll come back and see this. Laban said, better that I give her to you than I should give her to an outsider. Stay with me. which is a nice way of saying, okay, I agree to your terms. Not a really nice way of saying, hey, I think you're a really great guy and you'll make a wonderful addition to our family. His answer is, better you than some schmuck that's going to come and ask me for my daughter. But that's his answer. His answer is yes, I agree to the terms. He agreed to it. Doesn't say anything about changing it up, which as we know. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. Now that's a beautiful line. I mean, that's one of the most romantic lines, if not the most romantic line in the whole Bible. The whole Bible. You never read anything so beautiful like than that. He loved her so much that he worked for 7 years and he didn't care. It was like a few days to him because he loved her so much. Beautiful. But he works for 7 years for her. That's a long time. That is a long time, especially when you're 40 years old. He's the original 40-year-old virgin, but now he's a 47-year-old. Vayomer Yaakov. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my time is fulfilled, that I may cohabit with her. So if you think I was joking, I wasn't. It says that he didn't have with her. What does your translation, by the way, Mary, say instead of cohabit?
That I may go in unto her.
Yeah. That's the actual Hebrew. I don't love cohabit. Then I also will say that go in unto her is a bit not romantic either, but there is a sense that that this was not just about living with her, but that he actually could finally sleep with her. That they could have conjugal relations. So what does this marriage look like? Laban gathered all the people of the place and they made a feast. Well, this is the first time we've heard of what happens at a marriage, because we didn't read about Abraham and Sarah's marriage. We definitely didn't read about Adam and Eve's marriage. There's nobody there. The God, the animals. We don't read about Isaac's wedding. We know that they were married and he was very happy after he had a marriage. But here, there's actually a feast. Here, there's actually a party. And that's the word, mishteh, a banquet, a feast. When evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and he cohabited with her, which is that word, vayavo eleha. So lest you think that they didn't have sex, that's why they use the word cohabit, so that you know. And again, however you want to translate it is, I'm sure it says there, and he came in unto her, right? That is what it says. Vayavo, that's the word we use. Bo means to come to, right? Now, of course, we have a similar word in English too, right? But we do in biblical Hebrew. Yes, and look what happens. Laban had given his maidservant Zilpah to his daughter Leah as her maid. Oh, that's interesting. Why did they throw that in there? When morning came, there was Leah. So he said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? I was in your service for Rachel. Why did you deceive me? Now, there is no question that Laban deceived him. Laban said, I'm going to give you Rachel. He didn't say, I'm going to give you a daughter. He said, the terms are okay. I'll give her to you. And here's Laban's answer. Laban said, it is not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the older. Wait until the bridal week of this one is over, and we will give you that one too, provided you serve me another 7 years. So now everyone is going to say, and again, some people forget that he doesn't have to wait 7 years to finally have relations with Rachel. He didn't. He had to wait a week. It still means that he has to serve another 7 years. So Laban gets now 14 years of work for what should have been 7 years. Now, at this point, that's a huge, huge problem. Because even working 7 years for a daughter, one would say, kind of excessive. But Jacob doesn't care. He works it and he says it was the time went by like it was like a few days. But now another 7 years means that his life is on hold for another 7 years. Again, it'll mean 14 years by the time he's done here. 14 years before he can get back home. It's a terrible, terrible moment when Jacob realizes that he's been tricked. But Jacob did so. He waited out the bridal week of the one, and then he gave him his daughter Rachel as wife. And Laban had given maidservant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her maid. And Jacob cohabited with Rachel also. Indeed, he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served him another 7 years. So he gets what he wanted, but it took him 14 years. It also has told us in a weird way that he's now wound up with not just 2 wives, but 2 maidservants. Well, these will be important, as we know, because he will eventually have children with Bilhah and Zilpah. Did he intend to? Maybe. There's also a strange midrash that Bilhah and Zilpah are twins too, and that they're actually children of Laban through one of his concubines, if you will. So as daughters of concubines, they're treated as concubines to some extent. I don't love that midrash, but it definitely comes out at a time when people were still slaves. So being a concubine was definitely better than being a slave girl, but it was not the same as being a wife. Look, I don't know what to tell you other than this is in the Bible. This is completely, it seems to be acceptable behavior. And he winds up with a lot more than he necessarily expected to, but not what he came there to get. He wanted a wife. He wanted a wife, and he met the wife. And it wasn't hard for him to find her. He found her the first moment he got there. But now he's there 14 years at this moment. At this moment, he's now been away for 14 years from his home. And he wound up being married to 2 women. One of them he seems to wanted to be married to. The other one he doesn't seem to be wanting to marry. Now there's wonderful midrashim on this because again, the rabbis were like we all are, like, this is insane. This whole story is insane. Like, who does this? Who tricks somebody into marrying their other daughter? So Laban goes from being what he seems to be as kind of a nice guy to being a total creep, right? Laban becomes one of our biggest foes, if you will. I mean, every year at Passover, we read a midrash that says Laban was our greatest foe, even before Pharaoh. He's not Jewish. He's from Abraham. He's a Hebrew, but he's not a Jew. He's not an Israelite. He's not Bnei Israel. He's our uncle, and he's related to us, but he's not a good guy. And so the midrash is that Laban tried to destroy us. Laban actually tried to kill us, not from this scene, but from the scene we're about to read, not today, but later. But Laban actually is our enemy. And why is Laban an enemy? He's not a good guy. This is not a good person. And he treats his own family poorly. But the midrash kind of goes beyond that because they say, how did Rachel go along with this? Why didn't Rachel warn him? Why didn't Rachel tell Jacob, my father's going to trick you? Why did Rachel go along with this? And so the Midrash actually says that Jacob confronted Rachel. And Rachel says, I couldn't do anything. My father threatened my life. Couldn't do it. He would have if I had gone against him. And The Midrash tells us that Rachel says to him, "What are you getting mad at me? You tricked your father. Now you've been tricked. I couldn't, this is what families do. You did it yourself. I didn't want to do it. Kind of got forced into it." There's a further Midrash built on that Midrash, which says that Jacob and Rachel knew that this was going to happen, that Laban would try to pull some kind of trick like this. And so the Midrash goes further by saying, this new other Midrash tells us that Jacob and Rachel worked out some codes. So that in case he did this, in case he tricked them, and again, the whole scene implies that Jacob got drunk that night and wouldn't know who he's sleeping with, which is why there's a feast, right? There's a mishteh, a banquet. So he's a little tipsy. He doesn't really know what's going on. But he assumed that this would happen, and he assumed that this kind of stuff. So they actually worked out a series of codes. And that Rachel ended up telling her sister the codes because she felt bad for her sister. The Midrash, built on that Midrash, says that God was even worse than that. That Rachel actually was underneath the bed, the marital bed that night. That Leah had a different voice than Rachel. Jacob would have known. And so they forced Rachel to be under the bed so that she would not only say the words that Jacob would recognize, voice, so that Jacob would be tricked that way. And that Rachel had to go through the humiliation of having her sister above her having sex with the man that she loved. And as we're going to see, she definitely loves Jacob. She does not want her sister to be married, but she has no choice. And that the humiliation was so great for her. Those Midrashim all give us this sense of what really was at stake here, which is that every moment that Jacob was married to Leah was a humiliation to Rachel. So it's very hard to read this and just say, well, he got tricked. Whatever. He wound up with 2 wives. Isn't that great? It was not great. And it was not the way things should have been. And again, should any of this had to be played out the way it did? And yet this is the ancestor for all of us, for all of Israel. Whether you were a Levite, whether you were a Judite, whether you were a Benjaminite, this is how all of us got here. So according to the Bible, this is how we all got here. The Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened up her womb, but Rachel was barren. And there's the word we have, akara, which means that she was a barren woman. We know, or you probably remembered this very well, that Leah has kids and Rachel can't. That's what we're going to read next week. We call it the arm race between the baby race, but the arms race between Leah and Rachel. That Bilhah and Zilpah get roped into as well. But what we forget is that the Bible actually said just now that God opened up her womb because she was unloved. That's what it said. The Lord saw that Leah was unloved and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. The Bible just gave us a justification for why Rachel can't have kids. And the justification is because her sister, who Jacob didn't even want to be married to in the first place, isn't loved by Jacob. What does this mean? Exactly. Why is Rachel being punished? Now, again, is what it is, right? I mean, they were in a situation for the way they could explain it. But this is really, really hard to understand because, I mean, like, what's the other side of this? If Jacob hadn't been tricked and he could have married Rachel, then she would have had kids and she would have been happy and everybody, and she would have had 12 kids. I mean, what's the consequence of this? I don't know. I don't have an answer for it because this line right here is a real hard line to live with. Because again, you can understand why the Bible says it, because Leah wasn't loved. She gets to have kids and Rachel has to wait. But it doesn't seem, I mean, what was Jacob supposed to do? I mean, I guess you could say that if he had loved Leah more, then Rachel would have had kids too. I mean, like, so God's compensating for his lack of love for Leah. Maybe God thought she has kids, then maybe he'll love her. I don't know. The Bible is telling us that these women have kids, and they don't have, one has kids easy and one has kids in the hard way. It's not easy. It's not easy. But in our minds or whatever, we're left with this fact that, wow, this was not in her control. So this is the theme that we're going to have next week. When we read this story of the children being born, the ancestors for all the 12 tribes, we're left with the fact that there seems to be a significance to each one of their births. Some more than others. Some get more attention than others when it comes to their births. But I will tell you that even the fact that which woman gets to have a child seems to be divine providence, if you will, at least from the Bible standpoint. That's not a midrash that I just shared with you. That is the words in Genesis chapter 29, verse 31. The Lord saw that Leah was unloved and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren.
Maybe he did that so there would be lots and lots of children, because if he only had children with Rachel, maybe there wouldn't be enough to populate what he wanted populated.
It's an interesting idea. And again, you can make the argument, the biblical author is trying to explain why, as Joyce just said, why he winds up with 12 sons and a daughter. Don't forget the daughter. But if this is the explanation for why we have 12 tribes, as Joyce said, that there had to be, these kids had to be born, then that's an explanation for it.
He withheld Rachel for a while so the others would be born.
Yeah. Problem, and again, that's probably, I think you're right. I think that's part of the explanation is how they have
children with the servants too.
correct. But Joyce's point is still valid, which is it just means more kids. He's got to get more kids. And this is the explanation. So look, the writer of the Bible knew that there were 12 tribes. And so we have this backstory of how we have 12 tribes, which Joyce's point is we had to get to 12 kids. And so this is how they have the kids. Understand, though, that with all that being said, this poor woman had to suffer without having children so that this could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a tragedy that I don't think the Bible really answers to a way that we can say, no. And so that's why we have, again, lots of midrashim about Rachel and about why she had to wait and what happened with Rachel and the fact that she is a kind of a special matriarch. But the suffering that Rachel undergoes seems to set the tone for the suffering of Jewish women, especially ones who couldn't have children, but also women who lose their children. And Rachel becomes the archetype for a woman who suffers, has blessings, but also to some extent becomes the matriarch of our suffering. to much in the way that Mary is depicted in Christian art and Christian images of a suffering mother. I mean, obviously Michelangelo's Pieta is the most famous one of this woman weeping with her her dead son, you know, at that point, dead son. But the Pieta, the Michelangelo statue is an example of a woman. I mean, the focus is at least as much on Mary as it is on Jesus. And so the suffering mother and the woman who has to suffer is what Rachel is in the first place, is that woman who at one point can't have children. Later on, she becomes our mother who suffers when we're in exile. And the Haftarah we read every year at Rosh Hashanah on the second day from Jeremiah talks about our mother Rachel crying for us, for our exile. And so Rachel becomes the mother who weeps for us. And whether she's barren or whether her children get exiled and suffer, Rachel becomes our matriarch who cries for us and who suffers for us. And it's a sad kind of role that she plays, but to some extent the Bible gives us this woman who to some extent this is put into motion by God. And we have to come to terms with it. We have to come to terms with the fact that there are women who seem to suffer disproportionately. And in some cases, as Joy suggests, it's so that the role that they play and the role that they are part of, even beyond their control, is able to come to fruition. But this is where we'll leave off. And next week we will be reading about the birth of the children, and we will pick it up there with the continuation of the story of Jacob, as we're now going to be reading about the birth of the sons and what it means for us and for the people of Israel. So I want to thank everybody for being part of our first hybrid, our first time together on a Wednesday night. And we wish everybody a good rest of the week. We're going to do services in person here in this room on Friday at 7 o'clock. I hope you can be a part of that wherever you are. And it will be Wendy leading services with me. And then again, we hope that everybody stays safe and healthy and has a good rest of the week as we move through this week. So everybody stay good, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, everybody. Bye. And we wish
Thanks,
you,
Rabbi.
we wish you safety and
Seeing
health
all
from
of
here.
you. So good to see all of you.
And we're seeing all of you. Don't forget, you're all up on our screen too. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.